One of the most highly talked about and touted prospects over the past 2 years when it's come to college football and as a consequence the NFL draft has to be Vernon Hargreaves III, the 5'10", 200-pound junior corner from Florida. This even dates all the way back to his freshman season when you had Purifoy and Roberson there. It was Vernon Hargreaves that caught your attention the most. It was Vernon Hargreaves that played at the highest level of the three. It was Vernon Hargreaves that you envisioned having the best potential at the NFL level. And then when you saw what he did as a sophomore, you're sitting there and thinking to yourself that, hey, this guy is a potential number one corner at the NFL level. This guy is a potential top 10 pick. This guy could be a difference maker at the corner position at the NFL level. But then his junior year season kind of happened, and frankly, the junior year film I don't think was as good as the sophomore year film. And I think now NFL teams are going to start to question what Vernon Hargrave's true upside actually is, what his best fit is in terms of a position at corner at the NFL level, and just how much of a pick he's worth come the 2016 NFL draft. And I have some of those same questions and concerns as well. Now, watching him on film, there's a lot that jumps out at me that says, this guy could be a really, really good player at the NFL level. He was a really good college player. A guy with really nice short area quickness. Not being that tall or long or strong, you have to have other things to compensate for that. And one thing he has is really good initial quickness. And he pairs that with really fluid hips. This is a guy that can change direction. This is a guy that can turn and run really, really well. A guy that moves pretty well in general, but a lot of it ties in again with that initial quickness. He has a nice burst. A guy that does a good job as well, I think, of maintaining outside leverage, keeping the guy in front of him, keeping the guy, where he wants him to be, keeping that wide receiver in one area of the field. I like corners sometimes that can keep that outside leverage because it means that they can naturally keep their eye on the quarterback. It means they're much more inclined to be able to play the ball and potentially make some big plays happen. When we talk about making big plays happen, Vernon Hargreaves can make some big plays happen because of that quickness, because of his ability to maintain that outside leverage. This is a guy that does a really good job of playing the football. Has some really nice ball skills, some of the best ball skills out of any defensive back in this year's NFL draft, beyond question. And then when you combine into the fact this is a guy that seems to be a really smart football player, that has really good awareness and recognition skills, he can put himself in position oftentimes to make plays on the football, and he does make some plays on the football. Not every play on the football has to be an interception, pick six. But he makes some solid plays on the football nonetheless. He's a guy that I would anticipate because of that quickness, because of that ability to maintain his outside leverage, because of his ability to recognize plays and recognize what the quarterback is trying to do. He should be a guy that gets, 4 to 5 interceptions many years in the NFL just because of those abilities alone. But he's more than just that. In terms of other things that I like about his game, he has a willingness to come up and lay a helmet on somebody in the running game. It doesn't mean he's a phenomenal tackler or anything like that. But I like attitude, and I like willingness, and I like effort. And to me, I always felt like when I watched Vernon Graves, I got a pretty good effort. That I saw a willingness to go get physical. Even if his body type doesn't necessarily justify playing at that physical level, he would try to play a little bit bigger than he actually was. And you see this sometimes in his press man technique. For a guy that's not that big, he's actually pretty good in terms of his press man technique. And that's something that could bode for him well at the NFL level because in a lot of cases, going up against outside wide receivers, number ones or number twos, he's going to be physically outmatched from a size, length, and strength standpoint. So he's going to find other things he has to do and do well. And along with that quickness, that awareness, that ability to maintain that leverage, this is a guy that is going to need to get by on technique. He's going to have to be good in his technique, and he's a guy that is pretty good at his technique. He's still got some flaws in his technique, and he can always get better at it. But there are things that would seem to translate well to the NFL level. A guy that also brings some nice return skills as well. So if you're a team looking for added value out of a potential first-round pick, here's a guy, especially as a younger player, you can maybe bring in as a punt returner, and maybe he gives you a little bit of something extra. So there's a lot to really like about him. But when I watch him, there's so many questions to me about him that I just don't view him as quite the same level of prospect, I think, as a lot of fans do, frankly. And I think my thinking might be more in line with certain NFL teams. Now, that doesn't mean that we're ultimately right either. But with that said, I have a lot of questions. First question I have about him is height and length. Just because he's 5'10" doesn't mean he can't play outside at the NFL level, especially with some of the good things he does in terms of his technique, especially in press man and maintaining his outside leverage again. But he is only 5'10", 200 pounds. While he tested okay in terms of individual workouts at the combine, at times that film, you didn't see a guy that was incredibly explosive as an athlete. So if you're 5'10", you have to be able to compensate in other areas, and one of those areas is you have to be able to win those jump balls. You have to be able to get the ball and meet the ball at its highest point. And at times I have concerns about whether or not Hargreaves can actually do that, regardless of how well he may have actually tested in the vertical at the combine. There were just times on film he was inconsistent in that way. Sometimes he would, and sometimes he wouldn't. And that concerns me about a team. If they see him on the outside, they're going to sit there and try to throw stop fades and jump balls over him all day long. Another problem with him, too, is he's more quick than fast, and his fluid hips help in terms of transitioning to turn and run, but he still lacks great second gear top speed. And that 4.5 40 that he ran at the combine is pretty much evident on film. That matches the reality of the player, that the further you go, the less likely he's going to be able to stay with the receiver, which makes you concerned again about him playing on the outside at the NFL level, because maybe he could stay with the guy in a 10, 15, 20-yard window. Once you start going any deeper than that, this could be a guy in a man-on-man situation. If he makes any mistakes at all in terms of technique or recognition, he's a guy that could get burnt and burnt deep often. Other things that I look at, when I watched him on film, especially as a junior, I sometimes just scratched my head and I said, why are you giving them so much cushion? Yes, you're quick and you have really good awareness and you have good play recognition skills, but you're just playing too far off of the wide receiver, which again speaks to maybe that lack of second gear top end speed, and maybe he's compensating for that by giving that additional cushion. Maybe it was McElwain and that coaching staff at Florida this year. They wanted him to play so far off of the receiver, but in a lot of cases he's playing 10 yards off the wide receiver, and I just didn't get it. I didn't understand it, because if anything, with that lack of second gear top speed, now you've put him in a situation playing 10 yards off, he can't really get physical with the receiver in any way, where, like I mentioned earlier, he has some good press man techniques. Now you're making him a guy that's very susceptible to double moves, especially for a guy with the good awareness or recognition skills that he has. Sometimes that could jump up and bite you in the ass. I got bit in the buttocks, if you will, because he can be a little over-aggressive. So with that tendency to give a cushion, it's something that could be corrected at the NFL level, sure, but if he plays like that at the NFL level, man, he's going to give up a lot of plays underneath, and he could potentially give up some big plays over the top too, because when somebody hits him with a double move, he's going to sit there and do this, and then the guy is going to go the other way. And you saw this on film at Florida during his junior year, I think. Far too many catches given up in front of him with too much space in front of him because he was just playing too damn far off the guy. He just was. I think he could have some trouble defending the slants and the inside routes. Again, it's in part because of that lack of length and strength and height. It's also because he plays that outside leverage. He does a really good job of that, but that means that he could leave the middle of the field wide open, especially with that tendency to give the cushion that he does. If I see Vernon Hargreaves 10 yards off, I might tell my receiver, go 2 steps, hook in, and let's figure out what's going to happen. So I'm concerned about Hargreaves' potential ability to be toast at times at the NFL level. I really, really am. And then I would like to maybe see him work on his tackling consistency. This is a guy that at times makes some impressive tackles, and at other times misses tackles that he needs to make in the open field. Again, something that can be worked on, something that can be coached on. When I look at Hargreaves overall as a prospect, though, he's a 3-year starter for all intents and purposes. Great sophomore film. Junior film, not as good. I'm just being honest. And I think opinions are going to vary on him. I think they vary on him in terms of the fans and, the NFL draft experts, and I think the opinions vary on him when it comes to NFL front offices. Some teams will see those strengths and those positives and say, we can work on some of these other things. He may never be an all-pro corner, but he could be a really solid number 1 corner for a good defense at the NFL level because of his football intelligence, because of his quickness, because of his recognition skills, because of his ability to play the football, the ball skills that he has, and the attitude that he has. This is a guy that you feel like you can win with as a premier player on your defense, where other teams are going to look at it and they're going to sit there and say, he's not that long, he's not that strong, he lacks second gear top speed. He's already at a height deficit to begin with. Now you're throwing in a speed deficit, and that leads to him having to play off with such a cushion that it could create all types of problems. And he's a guy that you might have to help compensate for over the top with the safety, which could really affect the type of defenses that you run and how aggressive you are as a defense. I think most teams will love his quickness and his fluid hips. They're going to love his toughness and the physicality that he plays with, even though his reality is he shouldn't be that physical of a player. He tries to play physical, and I like that. I think teams will absolutely love that. But I don't know that teams are going to like his size, and that sometimes he does on the flip side, whereas other times he tries to play bigger than he actually is. I think there are times that he plays smaller than he actually is, and this is more evident, I think, in coverage. And when you're already 5'9", 5'10" to begin with, you don't really want to be playing smaller than you actually are in coverage. And I think teams will be really concerned about that lack of top end speed combined with size. There are going to be some teams that, I'll tell you right now, are going to grade him as a slot corner and they'll have him as a round 2 talent. There'll be some teams that might grade him as a top 10 or top 15 pick. I think there's going to be a lot of wide, varying opinions on his draft stock. To me, I look at him and I see a guy that's a good football player. I don't know if he'll be great at the NFL level. I think he can start on the outside, but I think he has huge potentially, to be a high-end, almost elite slot nickel corner at the NFL level, which is basically a starter now anyways, especially if you're confining him to a 10, 15, 20-yard window where you're not as concerned about him getting beat over the top. You can play him a little closer to the wide receiver where he's playing against slot guys. He can utilize some of his very good press technique, his quickness, his fluid hips in a short area to be incredibly effective, especially with his play recognition skills and his ability to play the ball. This guy could be a top-notch nickel corner. And in today's NFL, I don't necessarily mean that as a slight or an insult. That's not a bad thing because that's basically a starter because the nickel corner is on the field so damn much. But with that said, though, how high of a pick will you invest in a high-end slot corner at the NFL level? Is he a first-round pick in this draft? Yes. I personally, in terms of a pure draft grade him as a high second-round talent. But in this draft, he is a first-round pick to me, yes. But to me, his draft reality is more somewhere between picks 13 to 21, or maybe all the way down to 25, somewhere in that range, than it is somewhere in the top 10. I think the top 10 talk is a little bit carried away. I just don't know that he's a special enough athlete overall to compensate for some of those shortcomings in terms of who he is physically. And his film doesn't justify him being a top 10 pick. In particular, his junior film just doesn't. I think he'll be a good player, a pretty good player at the NFL level. And I think he could be a damn near special, elite slot corner. But if you're a team that has a terrible defense, do you really want to spend a top 10 pick on a slot corner who very rarely, if ever, is going to match up against teams' number 1 wide receivers? I think that's a fair question. I think it's a legitimate question. Some people will point to Joe Hayden, who wasn't the biggest guy coming out of Florida, and say that Vernon Hargreaves should be similar to him. Maybe that's a lazy comparison because they went to the same school, but I see some of that. And yeah, I guess at the end of the day, Joe Hayden ended up being a top 10 pick, and he's had some good moments in the NFL, that's for sure. But in this draft, this isn't a great corner class to begin with, and I just think Vernon Hargreaves has been a recipient of some very good hype over the past couple of years, and some of it justified, but frankly, some of it not. The top 10 pick hype, based off of the reality of the film and where he projects at the NFL level, I think it's a little bit carried away. Like I said, in this draft, still a first-round pick to me. If Vernon Hargreaves went in round 2, then again, it speaks to the lack of intelligence of many front offices in the NFL, in my opinion, many scouting departments. Because you cannot possibly tell me there are 31 better players in this draft than Vernon Hargreaves. I'm sorry. I'm just not buying it. But do I think there are 15 or maybe 20 players in this draft better than Vernon Hargreaves? Yes, I do. And that's why I think somewhere between picks 13 to all the way down to maybe 25 at the Steelers at the very, very lowest is where he should be selected in the 2016 NFL Draft.